It's strange how the loudest exits often happen quietly. No press conference. No glossy farewell. No carefully staged photo at the gate. Just a listing. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, when the news broke that Harry and Meghan's Riven Rock home in Montecito was being prepared for sale, it didn't feel like a routine real estate move. It felt heavier, like a sentence ending without punctuation, like a decision that had been made long before anyone was supposed to notice. Because here's the uncomfortable question we have to start with. Even if it makes people shift in their seats, why now? Not are they selling? That part increasingly answers itself. The real question is why this moment, why this house, and why in a way that feels almost deliberately understated, as if the announcement itself were trying not to exist. For years, Montecito wasn't just an address, it was a statement, a destination chosen very publicly, very intentionally, and framed as the beginning of something permanent, a retreat, a refuge, a reset. We were told, implicitly and explicitly, that this was where stability would finally take root, where the turbulence would settle, where the noise would fade. And now, quietly, that chapter appears to be closing. But this isn't a story about a house. Not really. It's about timing, about signals, about what happens when a carefully maintained narrative starts to thin at the edges. Not with a bang, but with a procedural step filed at just the right moment. A moment that, if you're paying attention, feels anything but accidental. Let's slow this down, because rushing this story would miss what makes it unsettling. The Riven Rock property has always carried more weight than its square footage. From the beginning, it functioned as symbolism dressed up as real estate. California sunshine, privacy hedges, ocean air, a visible pivot away from everything that came before. This wasn't just where they lived. It was where they were supposed to become something new. And that's why the sale lands differently, because selling a symbol is never just about the asset. It's about what the symbol stopped doing for you. Now, if this were a standard celebrity relocation, the pattern would be familiar. A relocation rumor, a denial, a soft confirmation, maybe a strategic leak to manage expectations. That's how these things usually go. That's not what we're seeing here. Instead, what we're seeing is a kind of negative space, a story defined by what hasn't been said. No grand explanation, no emotional framing, just a practical shift that raises far more questions than it answers. And that's where the unease creeps in. Because when people sell homes like this, homes that were once described as sanctuaries, there are usually only a handful of reasons. Financial recalibration, lifestyle change, strategic repositioning, emotional fatigue, or some combination of all four. But the public story has insisted for a long time that none of those pressures applied here. So which version is true? And if the answer is both, then something fundamental has changed. It's tempting, especially in the current media environment, to reduce moments like this to gossip, to skip straight to speculation, to assign motives quickly and loudly. But that's not how the real story reveals itself. Real shifts announce themselves indirectly, through timing, through silence, through decisions that don't quite line up with the narrative we were given. And this decision doesn't line up, not cleanly. Consider the broader context. Over the past year, public messaging emphasized continuity, forward momentum, ongoing projects, long-term positioning. Nothing about that messaging suggested a major physical departure, especially not from a property that had been so carefully woven into the public identity of life after everything. And yet, here we are. So we have to ask something even more uncomfortable. What if the decision to leave Montecito wasn't reactive? What if it wasn't triggered by a sudden event, or a financial jolt, or a single disagreement? What if this was the final step of a process that started quietly months ago, maybe even earlier, while the public story continued as if nothing had changed? That possibility reframes everything. Because if that's true, then the sale itself isn't the news. It's the confirmation. And confirmations in stories like this tend to arrive late. There's another layer here that's easy to overlook if you're not careful. Montecito offered something very specific when it was chosen: distance. Not just geographic distance, distance from institutions, distance from expectations, distance from scrutiny that felt inherited rather than earned. But distance cuts both ways. It insulates, yes, but it also isolates. And over time, isolation has a way of revealing whether it was ever a solution or just a pause. You don't sell a house like this lightly. Not one wrapped in this much intention. Not one tied so closely to the story you told the world about who you were becoming. Unless the cost of staying starts to outweigh the value of what it represents. And that's where this stops being about square footage and starts being about pressure. Pressure that doesn't announce itself all at once. Pressure that accumulates. Pressure that builds quietly behind carefully curated appearances and forward-looking statements. Pressure that eventually forces a choice. Stay and maintain something that no longer fits, or leave and accept that the story you told before may no longer hold. That choice is rarely neat, it's rarely clean, and it's almost never explained honestly in the moment it happens. Which brings us back to the way this exit is unfolding. Quiet, procedural, almost reluctant to be noticed. There's a reason seasoned observers pay close attention to how stories break, not just what they say. Because tone is information, timing is information, silence is information. And right now, the information we're getting suggests deliberation, not impulse. It suggests planning. It suggests that Montecito, for all its promise, stopped being the right place for whatever comes next, long before anyone was ready to acknowledge that publicly. Ask yourself this: if everything was working exactly as intended, would this move feel so muted? Would there be this sense of something unresolved? Or would the story feel celebratory, framed as an upgrade, a next chapter, a confident leap forward? Instead, what we're left with is ambiguity. And ambiguity in moments like this is rarely accidental. It's protective. It buys time. It allows a narrative to adjust gradually, rather than snapping under the weight of sudden truth. And that may be the most telling detail of all. Because when people are proud of a move, they explain it. When they're still negotiating its meaning, even internally, they don't. So where does that leave us? At the beginning, not the end. At the moment where a single listing forces us to re-examine years of assumptions about permanence, about intention, about whether Montecito was ever meant to be a final destination or just a carefully chosen holding pattern. In the next section, we're going to look closely at how this listing came to light in the first place. Not the rumors, not the reactions, but the mechanics, the timing, the quiet decisions that allowed this information to surface the way it did. Because once you understand how the sale emerged and why it emerged the way it did, it becomes impossible to believe this story started with a house. The first thing to understand about this listing is that it wasn't supposed to make noise. That's not conjecture. That's how this level of real estate works. Homes like this don't announce themselves. They whisper. They move through back channels, private brokers, word-of-mouth networks that exist precisely to avoid headlines. When a property like the Riven Rock estate surfaces publicly, even indirectly, it's almost always because something in the original plan has shifted. So the question isn't how people found out. The question is why anyone was allowed to find out at all. Because if discretion had been the priority from the beginning, this could have remained invisible for months, maybe longer. Off-market listings are not unusual at this tier. In fact, they're the norm. What's unusual is when a property so closely tied to a carefully maintained public narrative becomes discoverable without a corresponding explanation. That's the fracture line. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The initial signs were subtle, a quiet change in how the property was being referenced. Small movements in professional circles, the kind of chatter that doesn't show up in tabloids but does circulate among agents, advisors, people who make their living knowing things before they're supposed to be known. Nothing concrete, just a shift in tone, a sense that something was being repositioned. And then, slowly, confirmation without ceremony. No announcement, no framing, no effort to control interpretation, which is, in its own way, a form of communication. Because controlling interpretation is something Harry and Meghan have historically done very carefully. Even critics acknowledge that. Messages are usually deliberate, timed, contextualized, rarely left to chance. This time, it was different. And that difference matters. Let's talk about how high-profile listings usually unfold when the owner wants privacy. They stay off public platforms. They circulate through trusted intermediaries. They're shown selectively, sometimes without photos, sometimes without an address, sometimes without any online presence at all. In those cases, discovery is not accidental. It's permissioned, which brings us to a quietly uncomfortable realization. This listing wasn't a leak. It was a release. Not a loud one, not a celebratory one, but a controlled loosening. A decision to allow the possibility of discovery rather than fight it aggressively. That choice suggests a recalibration. Not panic, not chaos, but acceptance. Acceptance that this chapter is closing. And acceptance is a very different emotional state than retreat. What's particularly telling is what didn't accompany the listing. No immediate corrective statements, no clarifying language, no attempt to reframe it as temporary or misunderstood. Silence. And silence in moments like this is rarely empty. Silence creates space. Space for interpretation. Space for reaction. Space for distance between the decision and its explanation. Which raises another question that deserves attention. Who benefits from that space? If the goal were to reassure, the response would have been swift. If the goal were to deflect, there would have been context. If the goal were to deny, denial would have come quickly. Instead, we got none of those things. That absence tells us something about intent. It suggests that the decision itself is settled, but the story around it is not yet finished forming. And that's where the mechanics of this listing become more revealing than the listing itself. Because when you examine how the information surfaced, not where, but how, you see a careful balancing act. Enough visibility to prepare the ground. Enough opacity to avoid locking into a single narrative too early. It's the kind of move made by people who understand that once you explain something publicly, you can't unexplain it. Better to let the facts speak first. Better to let the house speak. Better to let observers come to their own conclusions, at least initially, while you remain uncommitted to any single framing. That's not indecision. That's strategy. Now, some will argue that this is just how these things go, that not every property sale needs a press release, that sometimes a house is just a house. And in a vacuum, that would be true. But this house does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a narrative ecosystem where every move has been read, debated, and contextualized for years. A place where silence has meaning precisely because speech has been so frequent and so intentional, which is why this moment lands differently, because it feels less like a spontaneous shift and more like the easing open of a door that's been locked for some time. There's another detail worth sitting with. If the goal had been to minimize attention entirely, the listing could have remained buried. If the goal had been to maximize attention, the announcement would have been explicit. What we got instead sits in between, visible enough to be found, subtle enough to avoid spectacle. That middle ground is uncomfortable because it forces interpretation. It forces the audience, including you, to participate in meaning-making rather than passively receiving a narrative. And that participation creates engagement. But it also creates vulnerability, because once the public starts asking why, there's no going back to pretending the question doesn't exist. So let's ask it again, more precisely this time. Why allow the listing to surface before the explanation? One answer is timing. The explanation may not be ready yet, not because it doesn't exist, but because it may depend on developments that haven't fully resolved. Other moves, other decisions, other conversations still in motion. Another answer is emotional distance. Selling a home like this, a home that represented safety, autonomy, reinvention, is not emotionally neutral. Letting the fact settle before assigning it meaning can be a way of creating psychological buffer. And then there's the third answer, the one people tend to avoid because it complicates everything. What if the explanation, when it comes, won't be a single explanation at all? What if this sale is the result of multiple pressures converging, none of which on their own would justify leaving, but together make staying untenable? In that case, silence isn't avoidance, It's honesty by omission, because simplifying a complex decision too early risks misrepresenting it. And misrepresentation, at this stage, could do more damage than confusion. So the house appears, quietly, without narrative scaffolding, without emotional cues. And suddenly, years of certainty feel less solid. That's the power of how this listing emerged. Not as a declaration, but as a fact. And facts have a way of demanding attention, whether we're ready for them or not. But here's where this gets even more interesting. When you trace the timeline backward, not from the listing date but from the behaviors that made the listing possible, you start to notice signs that suggest this wasn't a last-minute decision. You notice shifts in language, changes in emphasis, a subtle reorientation away from place-based identity. Nothing dramatic, nothing definitive, just enough to register once you know what you're looking for. Which means the sale didn't begin with paperwork. It began with disengagement. And disengagement is almost always quieter than commitment. In the next section, we're going to examine what the Riven Rock property was supposed to represent, and how that meaning began to erode long before the listing ever appeared. Because once you understand how the symbol changed, the sale stops feeling surprising at all. At the beginning, the house was never just a house. That's easy to forget now, especially once a listing enters the conversation, and everything starts to sound transactional. Square footage, acreage, valuation. But when the Riven Rock property first entered the public imagination, none of that was the point. The point was what it stood for, and that's where this story really starts to complicate itself. Because symbols age, and when they do, they don't usually collapse all at once. They thin, they fade, they lose sharpness around the edges. They stop doing the emotional work they were hired to do. Riven Rock was hired to do a lot of emotional work. Think back to the moment it was revealed. The timing, the framing, the way the property was described not just in lifestyle terms but in almost philosophical ones. Privacy, sanctuary, space to breathe, a place to raise a family away from the relentless glare. A home chosen deliberately, not impulsively. California not as excess, but as refuge. It wasn't sold to the public as a trophy. It was sold as an answer to pressure, an answer to scrutiny, an answer to a chapter that had ended badly and needed distance to recover from. And that framing mattered, because it asked the audience to see Montecito not as escape, but as resolution. This is where things get subtle. Homes that function as answers are fragile, because the moment they stop answering the question they were chosen to solve, they start to feel wrong, even if nothing about the structure itself has changed. Same walls, same views, same security, different emotional math. Over time, the language around the house began to shift. At first, almost imperceptibly, less emphasis on rootedness, more emphasis on movement, on projects, on outward-facing work. The house remained in the background, but no longer at the center of the story. That doesn't mean dissatisfaction. Not necessarily. It means the symbol was being asked to stretch beyond its original purpose, and symbols don't stretch well. Riven Rock was chosen to hold still, to be the place where everything else slowed down. But the reality of their public lives didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated in new directions. Media ventures, global conversations, legal entanglements, ongoing ties to institutions they were supposedly distancing from. The house, meanwhile, stayed put, and that's when a gap begins to open. A gap between what a place represents and what it can realistically sustain. It's worth asking a question here, quietly, without accusation. Can a home designed as a refuge survive when refuge is no longer the primary need? Because if your life becomes about projection rather than protection, the place you chose to hide may start to feel misaligned. This isn't uncommon. Even outside celebrity contexts, people buy homes for who they think they're about to be. Then life veers. The home doesn't follow. And slowly, without any dramatic incident, the emotional contract dissolves. What makes this case different is how public the original contract was. Montecito was not just chosen, it was narrated. And narrated homes carry expectations. Expectations that the place will continue to symbolize stability, even when the people inside it are evolving. Expectations that the address itself communicates permanence, rootedness, resolution. But permanence is heavy, and it can turn into pressure if it no longer fits. There's another layer here that complicates the symbolism even further. Riven Rock is historically associated with retreat, with seclusion, with people stepping away from something, fame, power, intensity, rather than stepping towards something else. That history gave the house gravity, but it also gave it a direction, a way. What happens when your life trajectory isn't oriented away anymore? What happens when your public identity requires engagement, response? Suddenly, the very qualities that once made the house appealing can begin to feel constricting. Too quiet, too removed, too static for a life that's increasingly dynamic and outward-facing. And that's where the symbolism starts to age poorly. Because a symbol that once said, "We're safe here," can quietly turn into, "We're stuck here." Not because the place is wrong in an absolute sense, but because it no longer aligns with the story being lived. Pay attention to how rarely the house itself has been centered in recent narratives. Not criticized, not celebrated, just absent. Like a background element that no longer carries meaning. Absence is important. It's often the first sign that something has lost its symbolic charge. If the house still functioned as a powerful answer, it would be referenced as such, even indirectly, even emotionally. Instead, it receded. And when symbols recede, it's usually because they're no longer doing the work they were chosen to do. There's a temptation to frame this as disappointment, as failure, but that framing is too simplistic. Symbols don't fail people. People outgrow symbols. And outgrowing something doesn't mean it was a mistake to begin with. It means the conditions changed. Think about the pressure that accumulates when a home becomes a stand-in for resolution. Every challenge that persists feels like a betrayal of the place itself. Every unresolved tension feels amplified by the expectation that this was supposed to be where things settled. That's an unfair burden to place on any address. Over time, that burden can turn into quiet resentment. Not dramatic, not angry, just a low-grade sense that the house is no longer aligned with reality. And that misalignment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't trigger sudden moves. It shows up in small decisions. Less attachment, less emotional language, less resistance to the idea of leaving. Until one day, leaving doesn't feel unthinkable anymore. It feels logical. This is where we need to resist the urge to jump ahead, to assume motive, to collapse complexity into a single explanation. Because the aging of a symbol is rarely driven by one cause, it's cumulative. It's the result of friction between expectation and lived experience, and in this case, the friction has been building quietly. There's also the matter of legacy. When you choose a place so publicly, you're not just living in it, you're inscribing it into your story. Leaving that place later forces a reckoning with what that inscription was meant to say. Was Montecito the destination? Or was it the interlude? At the time, it was framed as the former, but the sale suggests it may have been the latter, and that reinterpretation changes how we read everything that came before. It suggests that the permanence was provisional, that the language of settling down masked a more fluid internal reality, that even as the story was being told, it was already subject to revision. That doesn't mean deception. It means uncertainty. And uncertainty, when combined with high expectations, often produces silence rather than explanation. Which brings us back to the present moment. The house is going up for sale, not because it failed, but because its meaning has expired. It no longer communicates what it once did, to the public, or, perhaps more importantly, to the people living inside it. And when a symbol expires, it doesn't usually get a farewell tour. It gets replaced, but replaced with what? That question hangs over this entire story, because selling a symbol creates a vacuum, and vacuums demand to be filled with a new place, a new narrative, a new orientation. In the next section, we're going to step away from symbolism and look at something colder, more precise, and harder to argue with: the timeline. Because once you map out when key decisions likely occurred and compare them to what was being said publicly at the time, a pattern begins to emerge that reframes this sale in a far more deliberate light. And once you see that pattern, it becomes clear that this exit didn't begin when the symbol aged out. It began when the story stopped matching the calendar. Timelines don't lie. They don't have opinions. They don't take sides. They don't soften edges or offer emotional context. They just sit there, quietly, waiting for someone to line the events up properly. And once you do, the story starts to feel different. This is where the discomfort really sets in. Because when people say, something doesn't add up, what they usually mean is that the emotional explanation feels off, vague, unsatisfying. But when a timeline doesn't add up, that's more serious. That's structural. That suggests not confusion, but sequencing. It suggests that what we were told may not align with when things actually happened. So let's slow this down and do the least glamorous thing possible. Let's look at the order of events, not the headlines. Not the reactions, the sequence. Publicly, the story of Montecito has been remarkably consistent. Stability, forward momentum, long-term projects. No indication of upheaval, no suggestion of imminent relocation. Even when speculation surfaced from time to time, it was brushed off indirectly by continuing as usual. Appearances were made, initiatives launched, language reinforced continuity. And yet, behind the scenes, certain practical steps would have had to begin long before a listing could ever appear. You don't decide to sell a property like this and then list it the following week. Not at this level. Not with this amount of legal, financial, and logistical complexity. There are valuations, quiet consultations, internal debates, advisors weighing in, timing considerations that extend months, sometimes longer, which means the decision to sell had to exist well before the public knew anything at all. That alone isn't shocking. What's unsettling is how that inferred decision date overlaps with moments when the public story emphasized the opposite. This is where the contradictions begin to surface. At various points over the past year, messaging leaned into permanence, into continuity, into the idea that this chapter was still unfolding exactly as planned. That whatever turbulence existed, it was being navigated from a stable base. And maybe that was true, emotionally, strategically, or both, at the time those messages were delivered. But the timeline suggests something else was already in motion, something quieter, something preparatory. And here's the key thing to understand. Preparation is not panic. Preparation implies deliberation. It implies foresight. It implies that a threshold had already been crossed internally, even if it hadn't yet been acknowledged externally. So what might that threshold have been? We can't point to a single press release or public moment and say that's when it happened. That's not how decisions like this manifest. Instead, you see a gradual shift in emphasis, a subtle change in how place is referenced, a recalibration of how often home is invoked as a grounding concept. Again, nothing dramatic, but enough to notice once you're looking backward. One of the most telling aspects of this timeline is what didn't happen. There was no moment of reaffirmation once rumors began circulating. No clear statement reinforcing Montecito as a long-term anchor. No effort to decisively shut down speculation with context. In other words, the timeline contains gaps where reassurance could have been offered and wasn't. Gaps matter because when public figures want to anchor perception, they usually do so proactively, especially when the stakes are high and the narrative has been carefully cultivated. The absence of that anchoring suggests hesitation, or perhaps something more deliberate, an unwillingness to commit publicly to something that was already under reconsideration privately. That's a hard place to stand. On one side, you have a story you've told the world about refuge, permanence, settling. On the other, you have a reality that's shifting under your feet, demanding flexibility rather than declarations. So you say less. You let time pass. You keep things vague. And slowly, the calendar starts to tell a different story than the words do. There's another layer to this timeline that deserves attention. Look at the pacing of major decisions and announcements unrelated to the house itself. Professional moves, strategic pauses, moments where momentum seemed to stall and then reorient. None of these, on their own, point directly to a property sale, but collectively, they suggest a period of reassessment, a moment where forward motion was being recalibrated rather than accelerated. Reassessment periods are when people ask difficult questions. Is this working the way we thought it would? Is this place still serving the life we're actually living? What do we need next that this environment can't provide? Those questions don't generate immediate answers. They generate timelines, internal ones. And internal timelines rarely match public ones. Which brings us to the most important contradiction of all. The public story required Montecito to remain stable for as long as possible. Stability was the anchor that allowed everything else to move around it. But the practical realities of preparing to sell required instability, or at least the acceptance that change was coming. You can't fully inhabit both realities at the same time. Eventually, one has to give. The timeline suggests that the internal acceptance of change came first. The public acknowledgement is lagging behind. That lag is where tension lives, and it's also where mistakes happen. Not moral mistakes, but narrative ones. Moments where messaging starts to feel slightly out of sync with reality, where observers sense something's off even if they can't articulate why. People often underestimate how sensitive audiences are to these shifts. Even without concrete information, viewers pick up on rhythm changes, on tonal adjustments, on the subtle difference between confidence and maintenance. Maintenance is exhausting. It requires constant reinforcement, constant reassurance, constant projection of continuity even when continuity is no longer guaranteed. At some point, maintenance gives way to release, and release is what this listing represents. But here's where the timeline complicates things further. If the internal decision to sell predates the listing by months, which it almost certainly does, then there were multiple moments when the decision could have been communicated differently, when a new narrative could have been introduced gradually, when expectations could have been reset. That didn't happen. Instead, the story moved forward as if the underlying conditions hadn't changed. Why? One possibility is uncertainty. Decisions of this magnitude aren't always final until the last possible moment. People leave themselves off-ramps. They hesitate. They revisit. They hope circumstances might shift again. Another possibility is strategy. Sometimes it's safer to keep options open until you're forced to close them, especially when public perception can influence future flexibility. And then there's the most human explanation of all. People don't always know how to talk about endings while they're still living inside them. They wait until the ending is undeniable. A listing makes it undeniable. Once the house is on the market, the story can no longer pretend to be static. The calendar catches up. The internal timeline collides with the public one. That collision is what we're witnessing now. And it's why this feels less like an announcement and more like a confirmation. The decision was made earlier. The acceptance came earlier. What's happening now is alignment, not initiation, which leads to a final, unsettling thought for this section. If the sale is the final step in a process that began long ago, then the most consequential moments of this story happened out of view, in quiet rooms, in conversations we weren't part of, at points on the calendar that passed without comment. And that means the reasons behind this exit are likely more complex and more deeply rooted than any single headline will capture. In the next section, we're going to turn to something even less romantic than timelines, but just as revealing: the financial pressure points. Not in a sensational way, not in a scandal-driven way, but in the way money always operates at this level, as gravity, subtle, constant, and impossible to ignore forever. Because once you understand the financial context surrounding this property, the timing of this sale starts to look less mysterious and far more inevitable. Money rarely announces itself as the reason. It doesn't need to. At this level, finances operate like gravity, always present, always shaping movement, even when no one is explicitly talking about them. Especially when no one is explicitly talking about them. So before we go any further, let's clear something up. This is not a story about being broke. It's not a story about crisis. And it's certainly not a story about sudden collapse. That framing misses how money actually works for people operating at this altitude. this is a story about pressure, about carrying costs, about exposure, about long-term sustainability versus short-term optics, and about the quiet moment when numbers stop aligning with narratives. The Riven Rock property is by any standard extraordinary, the kind of estate that signals permanence, success, insulation from ordinary constraints. But estates like this don't just sit there passively. They consume resources, constantly, invisibly, relentlessly. Maintenance alone at this level isn't a line item. It's an ecosystem. Security, landscaping, staffing, insurance, upkeep, property taxes that don't care how often the house is occupied, utilities scaled to a footprint designed for grandeur, not efficiency. Every month, the meter runs. And that's before you factor in the opportunity cost. Capital tied up in real estate is capital not available elsewhere. It's frozen, anchored, illiquid. And when your public life depends on flexibility, on being able to pivot, invest, respond, illiquidity becomes more than an inconvenience. It becomes a strategic constraint. This is where the conversation usually gets uncomfortable, because people like to imagine that wealth at this level is endless, that once you cross a certain threshold, the math stops mattering. It doesn't. The math always matters. It just becomes more complex. Over the past few years, the financial architecture surrounding Harry and Meghan has shifted significantly. Revenue streams that were once projected as long-term and stable have faced recalibration. Some delivered, some didn't. Some evolved in directions that required reinvestment rather than payoff. Again, not failure, adjustment. But adjustments change tolerance for fixed costs. When your income becomes more project-based, more cyclical, more dependent on timing and reception, the appetite for a permanent, high-burn asset naturally decreases, even if you can afford it. Especially if you can afford to be strategic. Because here's the thing people often miss. Being able to carry something doesn't mean it's smart to carry it forever. We need to talk about exposure. A property like Riven Rock isn't just expensive to own, it's expensive to hold in a changing environment. Market conditions shift, public perception shifts, security needs shift, insurance markets tighten, local expectations evolve. What once felt like a fortress can start to feel like a liability. Not because it's unsafe, but because it's visible. Visibility costs money, and Montecito, despite its reputation for discretion, is not invisible. It's a known enclave, a symbolic one, a place that attracts attention precisely because of who lives there and who has lived there. Every additional layer of attention increases operating cost. Not linearly, exponentially. Security intensifies, privacy erodes. Mitigation becomes constant rather than occasional. That kind of environment demands resources, not just to maintain the property, but to maintain the illusion of normalcy around it. At some point, you have to ask a hard question. Is the asset still serving us, or are we serving the asset? That's not a moral question. It's a managerial one, and it's often the question that triggers reevaluation. There's also timing to consider. Real estate decisions at this level are rarely made in isolation from broader financial planning. They're coordinated with tax considerations, portfolio rebalancing, and long-term strategy. Selling when conditions are favorable, or at least predictable, is very different from selling reactively later. This matters because the timing of this listing suggests foresight rather than urgency, a choice to move before external pressures force less optimal decisions. A decision made while options are still open. And that implies planning, not distress. Still, planning doesn't happen without motivation. So what might that motivation be? One factor is burn rate. High-profile lives have high fixed costs beyond housing. Legal fees, advisory teams, public relations infrastructure, security across multiple locations, travel logistics that don't scale down easily. These costs persist whether projects succeed or stall, which means financial planning at this level isn't about income alone. It's about endurance. How long can this configuration be sustained without constraining future choices? And here's where the house becomes relevant again. A property like Riven Rock locks you into a configuration, a geographic one, A cost one, a narrative one. It assumes a certain lifestyle cadence, one that may no longer match how life is actually being lived. If time is increasingly spent elsewhere, if work requires movement, if priorities shift away from seclusion toward engagement, then the house stops being a base and starts being an anchor. Anchors are useful until you need to move. Another layer to this is liquidity for reinvention. If a strategic reset is underway, and we'll get to that more directly later, then freeing up capital becomes essential. Not because of shortage, but because of optionality. Because having resources available when opportunity arises matters more than having them tied up in stone and hedges. This is where financial pressure doesn't look like strain. It looks like rationalization, streamlining, rebalancing, reducing fixed exposure in favor of flexibility. Those are the moves of people thinking forward, not backward. But rationalization can still feel like loss, especially when the asset being rationalized was once infused with emotional meaning. That tension between logic and attachment is where hesitation lives. And hesitation is exactly what we saw in the timeline. A delay between internal acceptance and public action. Financial gravity doesn't pull all at once. It tugs, constantly, quietly, until resistance becomes more costly than movement. And then movement happens. What's also worth noting is the absence of replacement signaling. No immediate narrative about upgrading. No hints of a grander estate elsewhere. No story about the next dream home. That absence is telling, because if this were purely a financial upgrade, the story would likely be framed as such. A step up, a lateral move, a strategic relocation to something better, bigger, more aligned with success. Instead, we have a step away, which suggests the goal isn't acquisition. It's reduction of exposure, reduction of fixed costs, reduction of symbolic weight tied to a single address. And reduction is not retreat, it's reorientation. But reorientation can feel unsettling to outside observers because it disrupts familiar markers of success. Houses like this are supposed to be endpoints. You're not supposed to leave them unless something has gone wrong. That assumption is outdated. In modern high-level strategy, flexibility often outranks grandeur, and grandeur can become inefficient. There's another uncomfortable truth here. Money decisions at this level are rarely driven by one partner alone. They're the result of collective assessment, advisors, managers, planners, weighing scenarios and trade-offs, which means this sale likely reflects consensus, not impulse. Consensus that the cost-benefit balance has shifted. Consensus that the asset no longer justifies its footprint, financial or otherwise. And once that consensus forms, it's very hard to unform it. You can delay, you can hesitate, but the direction is set. This brings us back to the silence. If finances were a sensitive factor, not scandalous but complex, silence makes sense. Money stories are easily distorted. Nuance gets lost. Rational decisions get framed as weakness. Better perhaps to let the move speak for itself than to invite misinterpretation prematurely. Better to sell quietly than to debate publicly. Which leaves the audience doing what audiences always do in the absence of explanation. They speculate, and speculation fills gaps, sometimes inaccurately, but the truth is usually simpler and more restrained. This sale doesn't scream desperation, it whispers discipline. It suggests a recalibration designed to extend runway, not signal distress. But here's where the financial story intersects with something more personal. Even the most rational decision carries emotional residue. Letting go of a home that once symbolized safety and arrival is not emotionally neutral, no matter how logical the numbers look. Which raises a final question for this section. If the financial case for leaving had been clear for some time, why stay as long as they did? The answer likely lies beyond spreadsheets. In attachment, in hope that the symbol might regain its power, in the desire to avoid admitting that the equation had changed. Because acknowledging that shift publicly means acknowledging that a chapter framed as resolution was, in fact, transitional. And transitions are harder to narrate than destinations. In the next section, we're going to move away from money and look at something even harder to quantify, but just as influential: Montecito itself, the environment, the community, the subtle fatigue that sets in when a place stops insulating you and starts amplifying pressure instead. Because sometimes the decision to leave isn't about what you're losing, it's about what the place can no longer protect you from. Montecito is supposed to be the end of the road. That's the mythology anyway. You arrive. You exhale. The world recedes. The gates close. The noise fades into a kind of coastal hush where nothing urgent ever really happens, unless you invite it to. Montecito doesn't chase relevance. It absorbs people who are tired of being chased by it, which is why it's such a seductive place to land when you're coming off turbulence. And also why it can quietly become exhausting. Because here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Montecito only works if you want to disappear. It works if your primary goal is insulation. If your definition of peace is distance. If you're content to let the world spin without you for long stretches of time. That's the trade-off it offers. Safety in exchange for stillness. But stillness has a shelf life. And for people whose lives are built around influence, engagement, and constant repositioning, that shelf life can expire faster than anyone expects. This is where the fatigue begins, not the dramatic kind, not burnout, not some explosive falling out with neighbors or the community. Montecito fatigue is quieter than that. It's a low-level friction between the life you're living and the place you're living it in. It starts as inconvenience. Travel feels heavier. Movement feels constrained. Every departure and return requires orchestration. Then it becomes isolation. Not loneliness exactly, something more structural. The sense that you're geographically removed from the arenas where decisions are made, narratives form, and momentum builds. You're safe, yes, but you're also out of sync. And that dissonance grows. Montecito's promise is protection. But protection only feels like protection if there's something you actively need shielding from. When that need shifts, when your life starts demanding engagement rather than retreat, the same walls that once felt comforting can start to feel limiting. This isn't unique to Harry and Meghan. It happens to a lot of people who choose seclusion as a solution rather than a phase. The place that gave you space to heal eventually asks you what you plan to do with that space. And that's not always an easy question to answer. There's also the matter of visibility. Montecito has a reputation for discretion, and that reputation is deserved to a point. But discretion isn't invisibility. In fact, in a place like Montecito, visibility works differently. It concentrates. Everyone knows who's there. Everyone notices patterns, absences, changes. In cities, anonymity comes from scale. In enclaves, it comes from conformity. And standing out in a place that values blending in creates its own pressure. It's subtle, but it's real. You become the thing that draws attention simply by existing differently. Security convoys become noticeable. Schedules become traceable. The very measures taken to maintain privacy end up signaling presence, which defeats the purpose. Over time, this creates a strange paradox. You move to Montecito to escape scrutiny, only to find that the scrutiny doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter, more persistent, more ambient. And ambient pressure is harder to escape than overt attention, because you can't point to it. You can't address it directly, you just feel it day after day in the way life requires more planning than it should. More coordination, more vigilance. Fatigue sets in, not because anything goes wrong, but because nothing ever fully relaxes. There's another layer to this, one that's easy to miss if you've never lived somewhere intentionally secluded. Places like Montecito are built around a certain rhythm. Slow mornings, predictable routines, a shared understanding that life unfolds at a measured pace. That's part of the appeal. But when your own rhythm doesn't match that pace, when your work, your obligations, your public life demand responsiveness, the mismatch becomes draining. You're always speeding up or slowing down to fit the environment. Neither feels natural, and that constant adjustment takes a toll. Think about how often Montecito has functioned as a backdrop rather than a participant in their recent public lives. The house is there, but the work isn't happening there. The energy isn't centered there, it's elsewhere, scattered, mobile. That's not an accident. That's a sign that the place is no longer aligned with the life, and alignment matters more than aesthetics. There's also the question of community, not in the neighborly sense, but in the professional sense. Montecito isn't a hub. It's not a crossroads. It's not where deals are made, ideas are exchanged, or momentum gathers organically. You have to go to those places, which means Montecito becomes something you leave from, not something you operate within. That distinction matters. Homes that function as bases support movement. Homes that function as retreats require return. And return, when frequent, starts to feel like obligation rather than comfort. That's when fatigue deepens. It's worth pausing here and asking something that rarely gets asked directly. What happens when the sanctuary stops feeling restorative? Not because it's unsafe, not because it's hostile, but because it no longer reflects who you are or what you need. People tend to assume that leaving a place like Montecito implies failure, that the retreat didn't work. But that's a misunderstanding. Retreats are not meant to be permanent. They're meant to create space for transition. The mistake is mistaking transition for destination. If Montecito was chosen at a moment when withdrawal was necessary, then leaving it later doesn't negate that choice. It completes it. But completion often looks like abandonment from the outside. And that's where public perception starts to clash with private logic. Add to this the layered complexity of raising a family in a place that is simultaneously private and intensely symbolic. Every decision feels weighted, every move feels scrutinized. Even in a quiet enclave, the stakes remain high because the meaning attached to the place remains high. That kind of environment doesn't invite ease, it invites caution. And caution, sustained over long periods, becomes tiring. There's also the emotional residue of expectations. Montecito was framed as finally settling, as grounding, as the place where everything would calm down. When reality fails to fully match that promise, disappointment doesn't always express itself outwardly. Sometimes it expresses itself as restlessness, as the sense that staying put is no longer the safest option, not physically, but psychologically. Because staying means admitting that the promise didn't fully deliver. Leaving allows you to reframe, and reframing is powerful. This is where Montecito fatigue intersects with something more existential. When a place is chosen as a solution, leaving it forces a re-evaluation of the problem. It forces you to ask whether the problem was ever fully external, or whether some of it traveled with you. That's not a comfortable realization, and it's not one people rush to articulate publicly, which may explain the silence. Rather than narrate dissatisfaction with a place that was once celebrated, it's often easier to simply move on quietly, to let the exit speak without commentary, to avoid turning a deeply personal recalibration into a public referendum. But silence doesn't erase meaning. It just delays interpretation, and interpretation, once it begins, rarely stays contained. Which brings us to an important inflection point in this story. If Montecito fatigue had been building, slowly, quietly, then the decision to leave would not have been abrupt. It would have been cumulative, the result of months, maybe years of subtle misalignment. That kind of decision doesn't hinge on a single incident. It hinges on a realization. The realization that the place you chose to protect you can no longer do the job you need done next. And that realization often coincides with another harder truth. Distance doesn't sever ties. It only changes how they pull on you. In the next section, we're going to talk about one of the most persistent forces in this story, a force Montecito was never fully able to neutralize: the royal shadow. Because even at the far edge of California, some things don't fade with distance. They wait, they linger, and they shape decisions long after you think you've escaped them. And once that shadow reasserts itself, the idea of staying hidden starts to lose its appeal entirely. Distance was supposed to do the work. That was the unspoken assumption when Montecito entered the story, that geography could soften history, that an ocean and a continent could dull the sharp edges of an institution that had defined so much of the past. That by choosing a faraway enclave, the gravitational pull of the monarchy would weaken, loosen, eventually dissolve. But power doesn't operate like weather. It doesn't dissipate just because you move away from it. It follows, quietly, patiently, sometimes invisibly, but always present in the background, shaping decisions long after you think you've outrun it. This is the part of the story people underestimate. They imagine the royal connection as a chapter that can be closed cleanly, a door you shut behind you, a life you exit decisively. But institutions like that don't function on clean exits. They function on continuity, on memory, on symbolism that persists regardless of physical location. And Montecito, for all its distance, was never outside that orbit. The royal shadow didn't disappear in California. It changed form. Instead of direct involvement, it became reputational gravity. Instead of daily proximity, it became long-distance consequence. Instead of formal obligation, it became something more elusive, expectation without instruction. And that's often harder to live with, because when there's no clear rulebook, every move feels interpretive. Every decision feels like it's being read for meaning, not just by the public, but by the institution itself, by the family, by the press ecosystem that feeds on royal narratives, by observers trained to detect symbolism where others see coincidence. Even silence becomes communicative. And in that environment, a place like Montecito stops functioning as an escape and starts functioning as a stage, not because anyone wants it to, but because the story refuses to stay localized. There's a misconception that leaving the royal fold meant leaving the royal story. It didn't. It changed the role, from participant to reference point, from insider to counter-narrative. And that role carries its own weight. Every professional move, every public statement, every absence, all of it gets filtered through the same lens. How does this reflect back on the institution they left behind? That lens doesn't go away just because you're physically distant. If anything, distance sharpens it, because ambiguity invites interpretation, and interpretation invites scrutiny. Montecito couldn't stop that. And perhaps over time, that became clearer. Think about the timing of certain moments over the past year. Royal developments, shifts in public attention, subtle recalibrations in tone. Even when Harry and Meghan weren't directly involved, the shadow lingered. Comparisons were made, contrasts drawn, absences noted. The story kept pulling them back in, whether they wanted to engage or not. And that creates a strange psychological bind. On one hand, Montecito is meant to represent independence, a life built on one's own terms. On the other, the royal connection continues to frame perception, often in ways that are impossible to control. So you end up with a paradox. You're far away, but never fully separate. Independent, but constantly contextualized. Quiet, but never irrelevant. Living inside that paradox is exhausting, because it means that even your attempt at privacy becomes part of the narrative. Your decision not to speak is read as commentary. Your choice to remain still is interpreted as strategy. Nothing is neutral. And that's where the shadow becomes oppressive. Not through active interference, but through perpetual relevance. Montecito may have provided physical distance, but it couldn't provide narrative closure. And narrative closure is what people crave after rupture. Without it, you're always mid-story, always reacting, even when you're trying not to. This is where the idea of permanence begins to erode. A permanent home implies a settled identity, a stable role, a sense that the past has been integrated and the future is unfolding from a secure base. But what if the role itself remains unstable? What if the past keeps reasserting itself in new forms? Then the home stops feeling like a foundation and starts feeling like a holding pattern. There's also the matter of proximity, not geographic, but symbolic. Being in the United States allowed for a certain distance from the daily rhythms of royal life, but it also placed Harry and Meghan in a different kind of spotlight, one that demanded they constantly define themselves in relation to what they weren't. But not royals, not insiders, not working members of the institution. That negative identity, defined by absence, can only sustain itself for so long before it starts to feel hollow. At some point, you need a positive orientation, a forward-facing identity that isn't constantly triangulated against the past. And that requires a shift, possibly a literal one, because environments reinforce identities. They anchor stories. They shape how people see you, and how you see yourself. Montecito anchored a story of retreat. But retreat is not an identity you can live in forever, especially when the institution you retreated from continues to loom large, shaping headlines, commanding attention, and influencing public conversation whether you're involved or not. In that context, staying hidden can start to feel like stagnation rather than safety. There's another uncomfortable layer here. The royal shadow doesn't just operate externally, it operates internally, in expectations and the quiet pressure to justify decisions made years ago. When you leave something as defining as the monarchy, you don't just leave behind rules and rituals, you leave behind a version of yourself, a path not taken, a future that will always exist in parallel to the one you chose. That parallel future doesn't disappear, it becomes a reference point. And reference points can be destabilizing, because no matter how successful your new life becomes, there's always an alternate narrative running alongside it. One that asks, what if? One that invites comparison. One that never quite resolves. Montecito, as a place, couldn't resolve that tension. It was too quiet, too removed, too static to compete with the ongoing dynamism of the royal story playing out elsewhere. Which means the shadow kept stretching. And when shadows stretch long enough, they start to touch things you thought were safe, like your sense of home. This may help explain why the decision to leave Montecito feels less like a retreat from pressure and more like a response to it. Not an admission of defeat, but an acknowledgement that the strategy of distance had reached its limits. You can only run so far from a story that insists on following you. At some point, the question stops being how do we escape this and becomes how do we reposition ourselves within it? That's a different mindset entirely. And it demands a different environment, an environment that supports engagement rather than withdrawal. That allows for presence without constant contrast. That offers flexibility instead of isolation, which brings us to a crucial turning point in this narrative. If Montecito no longer served as effective insulation from the royal shadow, then its primary purpose had been compromised. And once a place stops serving its core function, everything else about it becomes secondary. The view, the privacy, the prestige. None of it matters if the fundamental promise is broken. And that broken promise doesn't announce itself with drama. It reveals itself slowly, through frustration, through recalibration, through the gradual acceptance that the strategy needs to change. Selling the house in that light isn't about abandoning safety. It's about abandoning a tactic that no longer works. But here's the part that complicates everything. If the royal shadow has reasserted itself, if it has proven impossible to outrun, then the next move can't just be another retreat. Another enclave, another attempt to disappear. That would be repeating the same logic and expecting a different result, which raises a provocative question. What if this exit from Montecito isn't about hiding?